Rock and roll. The very name sends shivers down the spine of music lovers everywhere. It's more than just a genre, it's a cultural phenomenon that changed the world forever. Man, it was like a bomb went off. The energy, the excitement, the sheer raw power of it all was something the world had never seen before. Back in the 1950s, America was a different place, you know? It was a time of conformity, of fitting in, of doing what you were told. The streets were filled with families living the American dream, but something was bubbling beneath the surface. We had just come out of a big war, things were kinda stiff. The country was rebuilding and people were looking for something to shake things up, something to break the monotony of everyday life, and then, BAM! This new sound explodes. It was like nothing anyone had ever heard before. It was loud, it was rebellious, and it was exactly what people needed. It was raw, it was edgy, it was full of energy. The guitars screamed, the drums pounded, and the vocals were filled with a passion that was impossible to ignore. Elvis Presley, man, he was the king. He took the world by storm with his voice, his moves, and his undeniable charisma. He shook his hips and the world went crazy. Girls screamed, boys wanted to be him, and parents were left scratching their heads. Girls screamed, parents freaked out. It was a revolution. The youth had found their voice and they were ready to use it. Chuck Berry was right there with him, duck-walking across the stage, playing his guitar like a weapon. His riffs were infectious, his lyrics spoke to the young and restless. Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, these guys were pioneers, man. They brought their own unique styles to the table, each one pushing the boundaries of what music could be. They were breaking down walls and changing music forever. They didn't just play their instruments, they attacked them, creating sounds that were wild and untamed. Rock and roll wasn't just music. It was a feeling, an attitude. It was about rebellion, about freedom, about letting loose and having a good time. It was a feeling, an attitude. It was about breaking free from the constraints of society and finding your own path. It was about rebellion, about freedom, about letting loose and having a good time. It was the soundtrack to a generation that was ready to break the mold and create something new. It was about breaking free from the boring old rules and finding your own voice. It was about standing up and saying, this is who I am, and I'm not gonna change for anyone. Kids were looking for something new, something exciting, and rock and roll gave it to them. It was the perfect outlet for their energy, their frustrations, and their dreams. It was the soundtrack to a whole new generation, a generation that was ready to take on the world and make it their own. Rock and roll was more than just music, it was a revolution, and it changed everything. The 60s rolled around, and things got even wilder. The world was on the brink of a cultural revolution, and music was at the heart of it all. The youth were restless, eager for change, and rock and roll became their anthem. It was a time of experimentation, not just in music but in fashion, art, and lifestyle. The stage was set for something extraordinary. The Beatles, man, they came over from England and took the world by storm. When they landed in America, it was like a seismic shift in the music landscape. Their arrival marked the beginning of the British invasion, a wave of British bands that would dominate the charts and redefine rock music. The Beatles weren't just a band, they were a phenomenon. Their music, their style, their charisma, it was all so fresh, so different. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. They were like four lads from another planet, with their catchy tunes and their mop-top haircuts. They had this incredible chemistry that was palpable on stage and in their recordings. Each member brought something unique to the table, and together, they created magic. Their songs were infectious, their harmonies were tight, and their performances were electric. They were the epitome of cool. Suddenly, everybody wanted to be in a band. The Beatles inspired a whole generation of young musicians to pick up guitars and start making music. Garage bands started popping up everywhere, and the dream of rock stardom seemed within reach for anyone with a bit of talent and a lot of passion. It was a DIY movement before DIY was even a thing. Kids were forming bands in their basements, writing songs and dreaming of making it big. The Rolling Stones were the bad boys of rock and roll. While the Beatles had a clean-cut image, the Stones were all about rebellion and raw energy. They brought a gritty, bluesy edge to rock music that was irresistible. Their songs were darker, their performances more intense, and their attitude was pure rock and roll. They didn't just play music, they lived it. Mick Jagger, with his swagger and his lips, and Keith Richards with his riffs that could melt your face off. They were the perfect frontman-guitarist duo, embodying the spirit of rock and roll. Jagger's stage presence was magnetic, and Richards' guitar playing was legendary. Together they created a sound that was both raw and refined, a perfect blend of chaos and control. They were raw, they were dangerous, and they didn't care what anybody thought. The Rolling Stones pushed boundaries, both musically and culturally. They challenged the status quo and inspired others to do the same. Their music was a rallying cry for those who felt disenfranchised, a call to arms for the rebels and the misfits. They were the antithesis of the polished pop stars of the time, and that's what made them so appealing. The Who, the Kinks, the Animals, the British invasion was in full swing, man. These bands brought a new sound, a new energy to rock and roll. Each had their own unique style and voice, but they all shared a common thread, a desire to break free from the norm and create something new. The Who were known for their explosive live shows and their rock operas, the Kinks for their sharp social commentary and catchy melodies, and the Animals for their gritty, blues-infused rock. These bands brought a new sound, a new energy to rock and roll. They were pushing the boundaries of what rock music could be, experimenting with new sounds and new ideas. Their music was a reflection of the times, capturing the spirit of rebellion and change that defined the 1960s. It was loud, it was bold, and it was unapologetically different. And the fans loved it. It wasn't just about the music, though. It was about the attitude, the look, the whole package. These rock stars had a style all their own, from their clothes to their hair to the way they carried themselves. They were trendsetters, influencing fashion and culture in ways that went far beyond the music. Their look was as much a part of their identity as their sound, and it became a symbol of the counterculture movement. Rock stars became icons, larger-than-life figures who represented rebellion and freedom. They were more than just musicians. They were cultural leaders, shaping the attitudes and aspirations of a generation. Fans idolized them, emulated them, and hung on their every word. They were the voice of a movement, and their influence was felt in every corner of society. They were trendsetters, influencing fashion, hairstyles, and attitudes. The way they dressed, the way they talked, the way they lived, it all became part of the rock and roll mythos. They made it cool to be different, to stand out from the crowd. Their influence extended far beyond the music, shaping the very fabric of society. They were the pioneers of a new cultural revolution. The world had never seen anything like it before. The British invasion and the rise of rock gods changed everything. It was a time of unprecedented creativity and freedom, a time when music had the power to change the world. And it all started with a few bands from across the pond who dared to dream big and play loud. The legacy of that era lives on, a testament to the enduring power of rock and roll. The late 60s, man, things started getting really trippy. It was a time of immense social upheaval and cultural transformation. The youth were restless, disillusioned by the status quo, and eager to carve out a new path. They were questioning everything: authority, tradition, and even reality itself. This was the era when rock music became more than just a genre. It became a movement, a way of life. The Vietnam War was raging, and young people were looking for answers. The war was a catalyst for a lot of the anger and frustration that was bubbling up. Protests erupted across the country, with young people taking to the streets to voice their opposition. They were tired of the lies, the violence, and the senseless loss of life. They wanted peace, love, and understanding, and they turned to rock music to help articulate those desires. Rock music became a way to express their frustrations, their hopes, their dreams. It was raw, it was real, and it spoke to the soul. Bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who were not just making music, they were making statements. Their lyrics were filled with social commentary, and their performances were electric, filled with an energy that was almost palpable. It became the voice of a generation. Concerts were more than just shows. They were gatherings of like-minded individuals who were all searching for something more. The sense of community was strong, and the music was the glue that held it all together. It was a time when you could lose yourself in the crowd and find yourself in the music. Jimi Hendrix, man, he was like a shaman, conjuring up sounds from his guitar that nobody had ever heard before. His music was otherworldly, a blend of blues, rock, and psychedelia that took listeners on a journey. He wasn't just playing notes, he was telling stories, painting pictures with sound. His performances were legendary, filled with improvisation and raw emotion. He set the stage on fire at Monterey Pop, and the world watched in awe. That moment became iconic, a symbol of the power and unpredictability of rock music. It was a declaration that anything was possible, that music could be a force for change, for revolution. Janis Joplin, with her raw, powerful voice, sang about love, loss, and the pain of being alive. Her voice was a force of nature, filled with a depth of emotion that could move mountains. She wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, to lay her soul bare for the world to see. Her music was a catharsis, a way to deal with the complexities of life. The Doors, led by the enigmatic Jim Morrison, explored the dark side of the American dream. Their music was haunting, filled with existential questions and a sense of foreboding. Morrison was a poet, a philosopher, and a provocateur, all rolled into one. His lyrics delved into the human psyche, exploring themes of freedom, rebellion, and the search for meaning. This was the era of psychedelic rock, man. The music was experimental, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. It was a time of sonic exploration, where musicians were not afraid to take risks, to venture into uncharted territory. The use of new instruments, effects, and recording techniques created a sound that was unlike anything that had come before. Bands like Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, and Pink Floyd were experimenting with new sounds, new instruments, new ways of pushing the boundaries of music. They were pioneers, trailblazers who were not content to follow the rules. Their music was a journey, an adventure that took listeners to new and exciting places. They created soundscapes that were out of this world, taking their listeners on sonic journeys. The concerts were immersive experiences, filled with light shows, visual effects, and a sense of wonder. It was a time when music and art collided, creating a multi-sensory experience that was truly transformative. Rock music became a way to escape the turmoil of the world, to explore altered states of consciousness, to find meaning in a world that seemed to be falling apart. It was a refuge, a sanctuary, where you could lose yourself and find yourself at the same time. It was a time of revolution, of change, and rock music was the soundtrack to it all. The 70s dawned and rock and roll got heavier, man. Led Zeppelin came crashing in like a sonic boom with their epic riffs, thunderous drums, and Robert Plant's soaring vocals. They were the gods of rock, and their music shook the very foundations of the earth. Black Sabbath emerged from the depths of Birmingham, England with their dark, heavy sound. Ozzy Osbourne's haunting vocals and Tony Iommi's monstrous riffs created a new genre, heavy metal. Deep Purple, with their organ-driven sound and powerful vocals, pushed the boundaries of hard rock. Hard rock and heavy metal became the soundtrack for a generation that felt misunderstood and marginalized. It was music for outsiders, for rebels, for those who didn't fit in. It was loud, it was aggressive, and it didn't apologize for any of it.